Good morning, everyone. Hello, hello. Welcome to the Levy Community Seminar. I'm Chris Rebelo. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Buck Institute. I always think of this seminar as back to school time at the Buck Institute, so welcome. Today, you're going to get some great information and I hope some inspiration when it comes to exercise. Dr. Simon Melov is our resident expert on the topic, and I guarantee all of us are in for a real treat with this event. There will be question and answers available to you after Simon's done with his presentation. Per usual, we're asking everyone to write their questions down. I'll go through them so that I make sure the most popular questions get addressed. Housekeeping, I need to point out the exits at the back of the room in case anybody needs to dash out during the event. I'm also asking that you either turn off your cell phones or put them on airplane mode. The signals sometimes interfere with our sound system here, so if you do that, that would be really great. I have some thank yous to our staff and to our volunteers who are taking time away from their busy schedules to make this event a success. I also want to thank Novato Community Television for being here. They're videotaping today's event. It will be online, so if you want to go back and review any material from today, you'll be able to do that. We've also handed out a survey about today's event. We ask that you fill that out before you leave the auditorium today. Our goal is just to get feedback from you to make sure that we're meeting your needs and covering topics that are of interest to you. So, some quick updates for what's happening here at the Buck. Uh-oh. IT support. Got it.
That's the end. That's why it's on the last
slide. Oh, it's on the last slide. Yeah. There you go. Thank you. Multi-talented guy. So there is a lot going on at the Buck. Briefly, I just want to update you. Next Monday, we will do the formal launch for our new Center for Female Reproductive Longevity and Equality. It is the first of its kind in the world. There is lots of information on our website if you'd like to follow up and learn more about the new center. Just today, just this morning at 8 a.m., we had a paper published from the Kapahi and the Campisi lab in the very prestigious journal Cell Reports. The study is about cellular senescence. It's now linked to venous blood clots, which do increase dramatically with age. So now I think there's going to be some hope in the future for having a treatment for those so they do not plague those of us who are getting up in years. And now, we have bees buzzing around the roof of the Buck Institute. I want to let you know, those bees in those pictures, they ain't generic bees, they're buck bees. So we took them. The bees arrived last week. They came to us courtesy of the Buck Impact Circle, which chose to fund a project spearheaded by Simon. He wants to find out why queen bees live so long compared to the drones, and whether we'll be able to exploit that difference for our own human health. And in the meantime, we're going to get buck honey out of it. So it's a win-win for all of us. So, mentioning the Impact Circle gives me a perfect segue to introduce our next speaker. Brian Van Weel joined the Buck as our Chief Philanthropic Officer about 6 months ago. He came here with extensive knowledge and enthusiasm about the Buck because while he was working at the Marin Community Foundation as the Director of Philanthropic Planning, he actually helped start the Impact Circle. So Brian knows a lot about us. I can't tell you how thrilled we are to have him here. I'm sure Brian would be happy to talk to you about the Impact Circle after this event, but in the meantime, I'm going to welcome up here because he has another task to take care of.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and we're delighted that you're here. The Levi Community Seminar is made possible by the support and generosity of the Levy family, and this year marks the 13th anniversary of this wonderful event. This educational seminar honors the life and memory of Dr. William Levy, who was a renowned dermatologist and clinical professor at University, California, San Francisco. Bill Levy was a beloved doctor. The quality of his care and the depth of his compassion for his patients were known and admired by all. A testament to longevity, he practiced medicine for 52 years and continued to see patients until his health no longer permitted. He was a pioneer and a visionary, and back in 1993, 6 years before this building was opened, he served as an early supporter and advisor, helping guide the launch of the Buck and creating the world's first research institute focused on discovering and understanding the biology of aging. Thanks to his efforts and the ongoing support of Mrs. Levy and the Levy family, we are all still striving to live better longer. So please take this moment to show our gratitude and appreciation to Mrs. Levy and the Levy family. Thank you. It is now my great honor to introduce today's featured speaker, Dr. Simon Melov. Dr. Melov received his PhD in biochemistry from the University of London in the United Kingdom and held positions at Emory University in Atlanta and at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Before joining the Buck, he was the third faculty hired by the Institute after its inception in 1999. He's a renowned researcher and scientist, leader of the Institute's Genomic Core, and as we just learned, an aspiring bee whisperer. That goes on your resume there. His lab takes a multidisciplinary approach to researching the core mechanisms that drive aging, and his talk today will focus on the benefits of exercise to enhance lifespan and promote longevity. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Simon Melov.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's just a wonderful privilege to be able to talk to you. That's the end slide again. We don't want to do that. That would be a very brief talk. In any case, I'd like to thank you all for coming here today. And as you can tell from my accent, I'm actually from another country, Australia. And I'd like to beg your indulgence for just a minute. Before I start, we've got a little bit of a celebration here today because we're starting to get insight into the mechanisms which modulate aging. And that's what I'm going to try and give an overview of to you today. The latest research which shows the benefits of exercise on health span, longevity, but also an exciting new program which many of you may be unaware of, and it is just launching, so I'll spend some time talking about that. But before I do that, I actually want to, as I said, beg your indulgence and get you to wish my father, who turned 96 yesterday, a happy birthday. I think if on the count of 3, you could say, "Happy birthday, Dr. Melov," and I'll document this from here. So, 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday, Dr. Melov. Thank you very much for that. Okay. Hopefully that recorded. Okay, right, so next up, I would like to just give you a very brief overview of what I'm going to be covering in a very brief format. So first of all, we're going to be talking about metrics. Most of you have been tracking some level of personal health over the last few years, maybe for many years, and we're going to talk about metrics a little bit and the importance of that and understanding the benefits to yourself as an individual for maximizing the outcomes of regular exercise. Secondly, I'm going to talk very briefly about the health implications of exercise. I think at this stage in time, everyone is pretty aware that there are some benefits, and I'm going to highlight one of those in particular. Third, I'm going to talk about MoTrPac. Who's here heard of MoTrPac? Anyone? No. Okay, that's not surprising. This is a very large initiative which has been launched by the NIH over the last 5 years, and it is just starting to get up steam. And I'll spend some time discussing that. And actually, MoTrPac stands for Molecular Transducers of Physical Activity Consortium. So no wonder it has an acronym. Okay. So let's just talk a little bit about what is exercise. Now, I think most people are aware that when you say exercise, that means some set of regular activities. But we actually don't have a good definition for what exercise is. And this is in part one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to get the general population to adopt regular exercise as a part of their daily lives. Because we have to understand why it's good for us. And if we can't define what exercise is, then it becomes difficult to articulate that to people who are reluctant to engage in sometimes strenuous activity. So let's look at this. I mean, here is a woman doing something which might be called exercise. Now, you have to give props to her at the least for the pants she's wearing. But you might look at this and you might, depending upon your background, say, this is exercise. But some people might look at this and say, well, she's stretching. I don't think that is exercise. On the other hand, if you look at this, I don't think anybody is going to say that's not exercise, right? So in a sense, when you look at people carrying out a physical activity, we all kind of have a general understanding of what exercise is. Each of the individuals you see behind me are actively engaged in an activity which is benefiting them personally from their own personal health trajectory. Some of these are sort of inspirational in the sense that clearly some of these individuals are competing at a very high level. In fact, most of these individuals are masters athletes. These are people who compete for the sheer joy of it at a very high level, oftentimes physically in advance or superior to people many decades younger than them. And each of these individuals is fulfilling their maximal potential. That is, we evolved to move. And this is something which I think is commonly not appreciated. But some 10,000, 20,000 years ago, our ancestors were wandering across the plains of the Serengeti. And we selected for genes which maximized our fitness in that environment. And that means we were walking a lot of walking. The data is not great, but what data there is suggests that our regular sort of day was filled with maybe 15 to 20 miles of walking. So that's the equivalent of walking from here to Petaluma and back, okay, every day. Maybe you had a day off, but in general, we had a lot of movement. What we didn't evolve to do in terms of maximizing how all our systems talk to each other is we didn't do a lot of this. We do a lot of sitting around, right? Because we had to get out there, we had to be active to ensure survival of ourselves and our progeny. So we have a whole suite of genes which essentially have been selected to maximize our performance when they're continuously in use. And when you don't use these systems, bad things happen. And we're seeing some of the consequences of that in the exploding epidemic of obesity on a worldwide basis, actually. And this kind of led, I think, to some organizations to come up with various phrases to articulate the benefits of exercise, such as exercise is medicine. Now, this was, I believe, coined by the American College of Sports Medicine. That is a true statement. And I'm going to show you some data shortly which is going to emphasize that in spades. Now, we're very lucky to have in the audience here the Levy family in the front two rows. But something which Brian didn't mention is that one of the members of that family who's here today and has been exercising regularly since the age of 50 is 103 years old. Mike, would you like to stand up? That's you. So This is Mike. You can turn around, give everyone a wave. Now, I had a little chat with Mike before we came in, and he told me he'd only given up biking this year, okay? So that emphasizes the interplay between a choice, a lifestyle choice. Mike chose to keep exercising from his 50s or so, all throughout the decades since, and he's reaped the benefits. Now let's not sugarcoat this. He's blessed with an amazing set of genes as well, right? Because Mike is in rare company. Less than 1 in 10,000 people reach the age of 100, okay? So that's 0.0001%, right? So I think it's actually 0.001%. Got caught out there. I knew someone would come up to me later and say, you made a mistake on the decimal point. But in any case, it's very rare to get to that age. So how can we understand why there are benefits to regular exercise? Well, that comes to metrics. How can you track your exercise potential? Well, is it 10,000 steps a day? Is that the metric you should be following? Maybe it's 30 minutes of exercise a day. Is that the metric you should be following? Perhaps it's 75 minutes of high cardio a week. Or maybe 150 minutes of moderate physical activity a week. Or maybe strength training 2 to 3 times a week. Or X numbers of standing for X many hours a week. Or perhaps it's just consuming 1,500 to 2,000 calories a day. The answer is it's all of these things in a combination which we don't yet understand. But there's hope for the future that we will understand this in the very near future. And we have all these devices now. Here I show Fitbits, a whole variety of different digital tracking watches, and what I now believe is the best-selling watch in the world, which is the Apple Watch, which has a huge array of digital tracking metrics for your activity levels. And so we have the increasing ease of tracking your own personal activity levels and being able to relate that to your health outcomes. And one health outcome which I want to talk a little bit about is exceptionally good at predicting your longevity, and I bet Mike has an excellent VO2 max, and that's what I'm talking about, a VO2 max. Now, currently, this has been linked to life expectancy, resistance to disease, all sorts of things which are beneficial in terms of your personal health and your longevity. Now, what exactly is this? Well, this is the only chart I'm going to show here. And essentially what this does is show you that it is a way of evaluating how much oxygen your muscles are using throughout work. Now, that work could be, for example, a treadmill here. This young lady here is on a treadmill, and the gas she's consuming in terms of the oxygen and the CO2 she's producing are being measured. You can also do it on a bike. We have one of these here at the Institute, and we're able to track our own VO2 max if we want to. It's still quite a difficult metric to understand, but essentially you have a graded exercise protocol with increasing intensity over time. The test takes about 15 minutes. You're burning more and more carbs as time goes on, which is the blue line. Initially, you're burning a high level of fat, which decreases as time goes on. And eventually, you reach your max, your maximum ability to perform work with this graded exercise test. So you literally go to exhaustion. You can't do it anymore. And that is your VO2 max. And so once you have your VO2 max, you're able to relate it to a variety of different health outcomes. Now, this is traditionally measured, as I said, using bike and treadmill tests. But it's getting easier because this watch I have on my wrist can measure my VO2 max as long as I do an outside run for about a mile. Now, it gives a pretty good proxy for VO2 max. You don't have to measure gas exchange under a static test like a bike or a treadmill. And there are a number of manufacturers who do this. Garmin, I know, also does this. Garmin watches can do this. And so the value of this metric is it has been associated with a reduction in every single disease you care to think of. So if you can increase your VO2 max, which is a simple training proposition, then you are going to reduce your likelihood of dying from multiple different conditions. Now, this is a sort of a complicated sentence, and I'm going to relate it to myself personally. So I'm going to share with you some of my own data, which I've tracked over the last 18 months or so. This is my VO2 max, which, as you can see, is around 55. It's about 54 mils per kilogram per minute over the course of about a year. This is May to May. And you can see that this is relatively steady. There's a little bit of up and down on this. It does respond to training. I would have to do a lot more training than what I do now to increase it more than this. This is actually a very good VO2 max for anyone, actually. And to give you an idea, if I were to increase my VO2 max from 54 to, say, 58, which is about 3.5 units higher, then I would have a 13% reduction in all-cause mortality and a 15% reduction from cardiovascular disease. That's the likelihood of me developing this. Now, because my VO2 max is so high, that's unlikely to be true. But if my VO2 max was in the 40s and I could increase it by that magnitude, 3.5 units, then this likely would be true. And that's based on hard data, which has been carried out in multiple studies, and it's shown it again and again and again. So you no longer have to go to a clinic and have your VO2 max measured on a treadmill or a bike. You can actually buy one of these watches, either Garmin or Apple or a number of other manufacturers are doing it, and estimate it after a short run. It's pretty accurate, and it's enormously impactful, because this sort of reduction in all-cause mortality is a bigger reduction in cancer from giving up smoking. So that gives you an idea of the impact, okay? So now I'm going to turn to a disease. This is the bad news about Alzheimer's. I think most of you are aware of this deadly condition, which is increasingly of concern to the national healthcare organizations. Every 65 seconds, someone is diagnosed in the US. 1 in 3 seniors will die from AD or some other dementia. The economic costs of this are gigantic. It's a growing problem, and all clinical trials to date have failed. Now, this may be because we're looking at the wrong target. It's not exactly clear, but this is an evolving, very active area of research. So what can we do today? Well, here's a paper published just a few months ago, which essentially makes the statement that associations of physical activity and a marker of Alzheimer's disease can be altered through regular physical activity. Now, I don't have time to go through all the data in this, but this was a large study. Some of the summary statements here, I think, are more important than looking at the graphs and trying to step through those. Beneficial effects in terms of improving cognition and reducing the incidence of Alzheimer's disease were seen even at modest levels of activity, 8,000 steps a day. So remember, going back to those metrics, you can track your 8,000 steps a day, and you can be sure that that's having an impact on the likelihood of you developing an age-related dementia. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to prevent it. It means the likelihood of you developing it is diminished. Similarly, greater physical activity not only appeared to have positive effects on slowing cognitive decline, but also on slowing the rate of brain tissue loss over time in normal people who had high levels of amyloid plaque in the brain. Now, as we get older, we get this sticky stuff accumulating in our brains called amyloid plaque. That can be reduced by increasing the level of your activity. So each of you here, if you have one take-home message today, is that increase your levels of physical activity and you are going to maximally benefit your own health in many different domains. So this brings me to MoTrPac. What is the background to this new program which is underway? Well, this is, again, a variation on the theme I've been hammering in this talk, is that exercise is a therapy for all age-related disease and dysfunction. And there have been so many papers like this. This paper is looking at a meta-analysis of many different studies, looking at whether or not exercise is useful in retarding the incidence of age-related disease or improving function, just like the study on Alzheimer's I showed you. So this study looked at 26 different diseases. They covered the range from psychiatric disease, neurological disease, metabolic disease, cardiovascular disease, pulmonary disease, musculoskeletal disorders, and cancer. In each case, regular exercise mitigated or slowed the onset of these diseases by carrying out exercise on a regular basis. In fact, the quote from this is, "The evidence suggests that in selected cases, exercise therapy is just as effective as medical treatment, and in special situations, more effective or adds to its effect. The accumulated knowledge is now so extensive that it has to be implemented." This was a clarion call to researchers and governmental bodies who dole out research funding. They convened a workshop. They decided to bring together experts in multiple different disciplines of exercise physiology, motor function, and aging, and they decided to put a large pot of money towards understanding how exercise confers these benefits. Because if exercise is as good or better than most medicine you take, then surely we have to understand how it works. We still don't know. We still don't know why is it that if you walk for 8,000 or 10,000 steps, or you run 3 times a week, or you do resistance training, that reduces your risk of age-related disease and increases your health span. And so that brought to the fore MoTrPac. Rather than me try and explain this to you, I've got a short video here which explains it by people running the program, including the director of the National Institutes of Health. So before I do that, let me just say that the study is 2,000 sedentary adults, 300 exercising controls. It's a 12-week program, and they're contrasting resistance versus endurance exercise in this program, which is starting right now. And so now, here's the video.
MoTrPac is a very important study in us trying to understand how exercise, physical activity, and sedentary behavior actually impact molecular and biological and cellular mechanisms of the body.
And what we're hoping to gain by learning about what changes in the body is going to help us to be able to better prescribe exercise.
This aims to try to go down that road towards much more specificity to say what's good for you as an individual as opposed to some more generic recommendation.
A study of this magnitude has never been done, which means we need a lot of research participants to help us answer our important questions.
In MoTrPac, we're actually looking for 2 different types of participants. One very interesting group is a group of people who already exercise a lot. They already train. The other really important group are the people right now who are not exercising.
And get them to start moving and see what was the body like before they were moving, and then what happens to it after.
We would undoubtedly find individual differences. And what works for me in terms of a combination of cardio and weight training might be very different than what works for somebody else. We want to discover that.
I'm Peggy Whitson, NASA astronaut. I have the 665 days in space, which is a record by a U.S. astronaut. I have more time in space than any woman. This particular research project is intentionally taking all of the different specialties and trying to integrate them together. Will give us a more clear understanding of the problem and how to solve it. In order for them to be successful, they need a wide variety of people to study because the human body is very variable and we need to have lots of research data in order to make any significant conclusions. From my perspective on orbit, it was a phenomenal experience to be able to contribute. Get out there and participate. Research is always a good thing to be involved in, and it's very fun.
So that's MoTrPac. In a nutshell, what they're proposing to do is recruit these 2,000 individuals, compare them to the exercising individuals, and try and identify the targets which exercise is activating in our cells and our bodies, which improve our function. It makes us more able to cope with the stresses of getting older and reduces the incidence of age-related disease. Now, this is a $200 million program spread over most likely somewhere around 10 years or so. It's actively underway. They're recruiting at multiple different sites throughout the US. Unfortunately, there's no sites near Novato. The closest site is Stanford, but Stanford is actually analyzing the biopsies which they're taking from these individuals, muscle, fat, blood, and so forth, using a variety of state-of-the-art technologies, many of which we use here at the Institute. So It's a multi-center trial. It does have an animal component where they're looking at exercising rats as well. And I'll show you just a couple of features from the trial which gives you a sense of the study design. There's a large document on the website which is freely available. You can look it up if you're interested. Demonstrating or describing the research protocol of what they are doing with this large initiative. Here's a very brief description where they screen the individuals, they get informed consent from the individuals, they randomize them to either endurance exercise or a resistance exercise program. They then measure lots of things: aerobic fitness, muscle strength, body composition, VO2 max, so on and so on. Then they actually carry out a series of graded exercise tests on these individuals for 12 weeks after collecting the tissue samples and blood samples at the baseline, and then they compare those at the end so you can see how the individual responds. And through this approach, we hope to gain a deeper understanding of the benefits of exercise, either resistance exercise, which is weight training, or endurance exercise, which is cardiorespiratory, most sort of commonly articulated in running or swimming or something like that. So the overall goals of MoTrPac are to assess the response of molecular transducers, genes, proteins, to a single bout of endurance exercise, EE, or resistance exercise in both sedentary and trained individuals. To assess the response of molecular transducers I think that's the same thing. No, it's not. It's actually different. After a 12-week period of supervised endurance. So this is the comparison of the pre versus post. Then finally, to assess these relationships amongst the above-mentioned molecular transducers and the phenotypic changes, the changes which happen in the body, the reduction in fat, the increase in muscle mass, to the sedentary participants before and after the intervention. So very likely, as a result of this program, within the next 2 to 3 years, we will have key targets which people are hoping to use to develop drugs to help the population who are resistant to the plea to exercise regularly, which is not a small fraction of the population. Now, I know if I ask this audience, how many of you have exercised this week, I'm going to get a 90% plus hands up. Yeah, there's 90% hands up, yeah. So it's kind of not a very fair question anymore because you guys are already educated, you understand this. But there is a significant fraction of the population who don't exercise, even if you articulate the benefits to them. And so what do you do with that fraction of the population? Well, you offer them potentially pharmacological solutions to help improve their health as they get older. The consequences of not doing that is blowing up the deficit by having a ballooning population of people who are suffering from all sorts of age-related conditions. And so I think we can look to people like this, and people like Mike here in the front row, for inspiration in terms of modifying your behavior in the sound knowledge that you are going to personally benefit from those decisions in reducing the likelihood of developing age-related disease and dysfunction, as well as maximizing the potential that you could reach 100 years plus, just like Mike. Okay, I'm happy to take questions now. Thank you.
Laura, you're walking around to gather your questions. They'll bring them to me. Since I'm up here, I get to ask the first question. Simon, talk a little bit about muscle mass and exercise. And I think there's research going on here at the Buck, right? What's happening at the Buck that's related to that or related to exercise?
So there's a number of programs here at the Buck, some in my lab, where we're looking at the consequences of loss of muscle mass. So loss of muscle mass with age is something called sarcopenia. We still don't know the basis for that, but we're very interested in finding out why we lose muscle mass as we get older. There's also loss of muscle mass associated with different disorders, most commonly seen with aging, things like cancer, where you actually lose muscle mass. One of the newer faculty members here, Dan Weiner, who's in the audience, he's over there. That's Dan. He has a program looking at cachexia, which is the loss of muscle mass associated with cancer. So there may be commonalities in the mechanisms associated with some of these functional outcomes of aging and age-related disease.
That's Great. There is a question here about what if somebody is not able to exercise because of surgery or whatever? What can be done? I'm assuming the drugs that would be developed would be great for that, but what can people do?
Yeah, so this is a great question. It's one we commonly get. Most often when you hear about studies like MoTrPac, where they're looking at a tailored program for resistance exercise or endurance exercise, people are looking at pictures of people on treadmills and bikes and going, well, I can't do that. You know, I have osteoporosis or I have arthritis and I can't do that. That's true, but the data is some activity is better than no activity. So whatever you're doing, you can do more than what you are currently doing. Now that may mean you're sitting in a chair using static weights. That may mean if you are unable to run or bike, getting in a pool and doing laps. That may mean even getting out and going for a walk. There are lots of different modalities. You have to be creative in overcoming whatever deficits you have as an individual in terms of being able to become more active. Everyone has some handicap with regards to what they can or cannot do, whether or not that's accessibility to equipment or even, for example, spare time to exercise. This is a big one for many people. I don't have time to exercise. You can always make time. So this is something which I think you just have to be a little bit creative in how you think about these things.
That's great. Somebody asked you, a couple people, to compare endurance exercise, high-intensity exercise, all of that.
Yeah, high-intensity exercise, for those of you who don't know, is essentially a 1-hour workout crammed down into 12 minutes. Now, I've done HIIT, it's called HIIT for short, high-intensity exercise, and it's pretty unpleasant. Now, if I go for a run, I might go for an hour-long run, right? And I listen to a podcast, and I might listen to NPR or whatever I'm interested in. And I'm sort of multitasking in a sense. But when you do HIIT, you are on task. That is all you think about. Can I get through this 10 minutes? Can I get through this 10 minutes? You know, you're really working hard. It is pretty difficult. That's all you can think of. Now, it's true that you've reclaimed 50 minutes from your day because you don't work out for an hour. You only work out for 10 minutes. But I can tell you, it feels like an hour, that 10 minutes. The benefits, though, are clear. They are equivalent. You can get the same benefit from doing a HIIT protocol as you can from a chronic exercise protocol. With regards to the other part of the question, which is contrasting resistance versus endurance, that's what MoTrPac is going to find out for us. What are the tangible benefits? We know, epidemiologically speaking, that is in large-scale studies of big populations of people, there are benefits to doing resistance exercise, weight training, for sure. There are also benefits to doing endurance exercise. Are they qualitatively different? Unclear at this point in time. So that's what MoTrPac will help address.
So I'm not sure if you can answer this, but is there any difference between men and women and how we respond to exercise and whether men or women should look at different protocols for exercise?
Again, I would contrast MoTrPac for this. They're looking at this very detailed. There have been multiple studies on men and women. Both populations definitely accrue benefits from regular exercise. The prevalence of age-related diseases is slightly different between them. I think the one most people are common with is osteoporosis. The incidence of osteoporosis is lower in people who exercise regularly versus people who do not. And so there is some evidence suggesting that weight training, for example, in women who are undergoing menopause is more important at that point than anything else, because the bone responds to that sort of stimulus in a way which is maybe not as equivalent, with regards to endurance training. But again, the answers, I don't want to give the impression that the answers are firm here. We know what's going on. We don't. And programs like MoTrPac are going to help fill in those gaps.
Got it. There was a question about exercise and inflammation, and I asked that because I know part of your lab is working on muscles and inflammation. Is there anything you can say? What's the research focused on?
Yeah, this is a confusing area because I think most people might be aware that, I think everyone here is aware exercise is good for you. Why is it good for you? We don't know. But one of the outcomes of regular exercise is a reduction in your overall inflammatory load. Many of you may be aware that as we get older, we have this so-called increase in what's called sterile inflammation. This is an overall sort of inflammatory state in our bodies, the origin of which is not clear. It may be something like called senescence. It may be some other process. But we get this increase in inflammation. People who exercise regular have lower levels of inflammation. So that helps in terms of maintaining tissue function and performance. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, because you would think that with the stress of exercising and working up a sweat, you might increase inflammation. That's true in a short term, but in long term, you actually lower the levels of inflammation.
So I'm getting a lot of questions about what's the best exercise program if I only have an hour a day? How should I do it? Do you have any, and I just want to say, Simon's a PhD, he's not an MD, but I'm going to ask him this anyway. How, if people are really wanting to start an exercise program, how do they start? What do they think about?
Well, I think for most of you who are non-exercise. Now, again, the audience here is maybe a little bit biased because most of you are regular exercisers. But those of you who are not regular exercisers and you're intrigued by what you've heard today, the first place to start with such recommendations is your doctor. Go to your doctor first, say, I'm interested in getting into a regular program. Maybe you have a medical condition which has prevented you or you think has prevented you from engaging in regular exercise. Consultation with your doctor is your first point of call. Other than that, there are many, many online resources from reputable medical establishments like Mayo Clinic and so forth, which have recommendations for exercise, graded exercise programs, so you can begin to ramp up and improve your performance. Again, watches these days or digital tracking devices, they're very, very good for keeping track and keeping you on point of what you are and are not doing. There was one of my family members, actually, who's elderly, swore blind that she was doing a certain amount of exercise and movement every day until she wore one of these trackers, and then she realized she actually wasn't. So the mental impression of your activity levels versus what is being objectively measured by one of these devices can quite often be very different. And so if you're in doubt, pick up one of these devices. They're not that expensive. They're anywhere from like $50 to $300 or so. So I think most people can afford a device like that, and it really helps incentivize you to move throughout the day.
Question, I stopped running 15 years ago due to concern about joint damage. Is it possible to keep running without damaging your joints?
The answer to that is clear. Epidemiological studies on people who run versus people who do not run. The people who run have lowered levels of joint disease than the people who do not run. This is counterintuitive. Bang, 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 you think. But really, think back to our ancestors on the plains of the Serengeti. We evolved systems to keep moving. That's how our systems are optimized and talking to each other on a continuous basis in terms of the communication between all the different systems in our body. They're expecting a certain level of movement every day. When they don't get that, they start going crazy and they start having poor outcomes. And maybe you have an increased incidence of arthritis and things like that as a function of not moving. So again, always consult with your doctor first if you have a chronic condition. Don't sort of leave them out of the loop. But they will help in terms of being able to give you good advice with regards to how to get back into exercise and work around any particular disabilities you may have.
How about exercise and weight loss? We didn't talk too much about fat today. What's known about that?
In terms of regular exercise, I think the data on this is pretty clear. People who exercise regularly have the ability to burn off, the bad fat. There's a lot of recent data out of multiple different sites indicating that different types of exercise can get rid of visceral fat, which is the bad fat, deep in our abdomen in a way which is pretty rapid and reproducible. So weight loss, in combination with a variety of other sort of lifestyle changes, most principally being, of course, diet, is something which you can fold into your overall sort of exercise program and your thinking in general.
So there was a question here about diet. How does diet relate to exercise? Somebody else asked about drinking water and hydrating during exercise. So diet, water, exercise.
Yeah, this, to some extent, is feeding into the internet, because the internet is full of theories and advice on everything. And again, try and go to reputable sources for your information. But in general, calories in, calories out. If you consume 10,000 calories a day and you don't do 10,000 calories of work a day, those calories being consumed are going to be converted into something which you won't be terribly fond of. Now, I always remember being amazed by Michael Phelps, who was the Olympic swimmer who shattered all sorts of records several years ago, when I heard how much food he ate daily. 12,000 calories a day of food. But the guy was burning 12,000 calories plus a day because he was in the pool constantly. Now, there are some people who will consume 12,000 calories a day and are not Michael Phelps. They do not look like Michael Phelps. Calories in, calories out. With regards to hydration, the data goes up and down on this. There's something called overhydration, which is actually a problem, particularly in marathon runners. People who are engaged in competitive racing, they drink too much, and you can actually disturb the electrolytes in your body. So there's been maybe a little bit too much emphasis, but I think in general the guidelines are drink when you're thirsty. Don't automatically just drink. You know, I have to consume 6 pints a day or whatever the latest thing says. Drink when you're thirsty, and our bodies are pretty good at telling us when we need to take fluids. There's some caveats on that as you get older. In general, you want to increase the hydration as you get older because our body's senses are not quite so equilibrated as when we're young. But in general, drink when you're thirsty.
So what do you think the future is going to look like, Simon, as far as personalized exercise programs? Like, what do you think the genes are going to tell us? Might somebody do better with certain types of exercises compared to others?
Well, we already know the answer to that to some extent. For example, 23andMe, which is personalized genetic testing, already has folded into their routine set of health reports whether or not you have a particular gene which is found in elite athletes. I do not, so I would not be a good elite athlete, but some of you in the audience might be, and maybe you chose a business career or some other career path, and you were unaware that if you had actually trained harder when you were in your 20s, you could have been an Olympic athlete. It's absolutely true that certain people are able to benefit more in terms of putting on muscle mass, over a short term than other people. And this is exemplified when you look at the body types of sprinters versus weightlifters, for example. It's kind of hard to if you're an elite athlete, to swap your discipline. If you are a marathon runner, you're never going to be a weightlifter. And that's probably because just through personal choice as well as overall population genetics, the genes which favor your ability to run long distances are overrepresented in marathon runners and underrepresented in weightlifters. And conversely, individuals who put on muscle mass really easily are more likely to have genes favoring that. So absolutely, the answer to your question is, eventually we will fill in the gaps in our knowledge through programs like MoTrPac, and you will understand whether or not it is more difficult for you to be an endurance performer or a weightlifting performer. Each of us has this latent inbuilt ability which could be unlocked with more information. For example, if you had the information, maybe you would choose to take up a specific sport to maximize the potential of your own genes. Regardless, it's going to provide a lot of information with regards to your personal health consequences over the next few years.
So you alluded to this sort of in the beginning. Somebody asks, where does yoga rank on the exercise scale? And I want to ask, does vigorous yard work, which I did last Friday, and housework, vigorous housework, does that count? Please say yes.
I hate those questions. So yoga, the reason I put those two pictures of the two yoga ladies up there was because it is very difficult to evaluate, this versus, the handstand with the leg out like that, right? They're both yoga. Similarly, I think that the difference between someone who goes out for a casual run versus someone who's a competitive runner, maybe there's a big difference there, but qualitatively the benefits in the individual are higher. I'm not sure that there would be a big delta between a person who did very mild yoga and someone who did hardcore yoga like the second picture, if you remember the lady doing the handstand. That woman, I have no doubt, has very many benefits from the practice she pursues. In contrast, the first woman who was just doing the stretching, maybe she doesn't have that many health benefits. But it's a question of intensity. And again, coming back to MoTrPac, that's going to help us answer it. Even though it's not looking at multiple different sports, it's just looking at endurance versus resistance, we're going to be able to learn from what comes out of that in terms of applying those findings to other sports. And with regards to housework and yard work, I know, again, it depends upon how hard you do it, right? You can do housework. You could call it vigorous, but your activity monitor will say it's not very vigorous. So it depends. It depends upon how vigorous you are. And this is where the activity monitor helps, because it's actually putting a level of objectivity in the measurements which is not there when you just verbally report it.
Two questions that are related, one that just came in. Can you talk about exercise and neuroplasticity, and will exercise help a person who is already experiencing dementia? So what happens in the brain?
So there's many studies demonstrating that exercise does help with regards to slowing the rate of onset of dementia. The farther along the dementia is when the exercise program starts, the less benefits you see. I think the data shows that as well. So I think the study I cited up there was a good example of this. A lot of those people in that study were in early stages of dementia, and they were still experiencing benefits in terms of altering the rate, the speed at which the dementia progresses. So there are benefits whenever you take it. The farther along you are in the progression of the disease, the less likely that the therapy will be beneficial. So, but that's true because you've lost brain cells, basically, in many of these disorders. So you can't get them back just because you're exercising more. So early is better, and preventative is clearly better. So.
We chatted about this before the event. You may not like this question, but any advantages in exercising in the morning versus later in the day?
So there's some data on this. The answer is not clear. There's some data suggesting that you maximize the benefits when you exercise early in the morning, but there are other studies which show you maximize the benefits when you exercise later in the day. So it's still an area of active exploration, I would say. So.
Somebody asked about saunas versus exercise. Saunas are a cool thing if you go in a hot thing. Actually, he got me. Okay, do you have any? Have you read any studies about that, or what do you think about the use of
saunas? So that's not exercise. That's an environmental change. That's an environmental change, right? Yeah, you've got some of the superficial aspects of exercise because you're sweating and maybe your heart rate is elevated, but you're not actively working. So it's an environmental change. I like a good sauna, but I wouldn't put that on par without going for a run or a swim or doing some weightlifting.
Somebody talked, and I read about this. There's a Danish study about different sports and longevity, showed that tennis added an average of 9 years to lifespan, whereas running and bicycling added only 2 years. The difference was attributed to the social aspects of tennis. Could you comment?
Another great question. For sure, if that's I haven't read that study in particular, but for sure, if social interactions are included in this, that may well be, because social interactions are well known to help longevity. People who are socially engaged live longer in general than people who are not socially engaged. I don't know of any study which is sort of linking those things together, with the exception of this study you just mentioned. It's probably true that many sports have various benefits versus deficits associated with them. But again, think about MoTrPac. MoTrPac is going to objectively answer a lot of this because it's a large number of people. We're really going to know a lot more in the next 2 years or so than we do today.
So, final question for you. How close do you think we are to a mimetic for exercise, a drug that could help if people are stuck in bed or if people are just sedentary? What's your
So I have two answers to that, and it's going to be Jekyll and Hyde. So the first answer is no drug will recapitulate all the benefits of exercise because there are very few downsides to the benefits of exercise. With the exceptions of what we talked about today in terms of, maybe a personal disability and so forth. But you can work around those in general. On the other hand, with regards to drug development, there's no free lunch, okay? You're taking a drug, it's going to have some adverse consequences. But it might be the best option available to you. And your quality of life might be better on that drug than off that drug. And that's always the case with medicine. The ultimate arbiter of this is do no harm. And in general, you want the quality of life to improve by taking a drug as opposed to not taking it. But it's unlikely, I think, that any drug will do all of the benefits of exercise because there are a tremendous range of them at this point in time. But again, let's look to MoTrPac, see what happens in 2 years' time or so, and we'll be in a lot better place to answer those sorts of questions.
So before we thank Simon, I want to thank again Mrs. Levy for making this possible. I want you to stand up. Can you stand up? She's right here. And thanks to Simon. So I want to thank you all for coming. Please remember to hand in your surveys. If you're not on our mailing list, stop by the membership table and sign up. I want to give you a little hint. We're expecting some very good news next week about a federal grant. So keep your eye out for news about that. Thank you so very much. Have a great day.